Welcome to 2019, 400 years of the Virginia General Assembly, and not nearly as many, but we are here to keep an eye on them here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy and our radio broadcast, Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Welcome in on behalf of all of us here. Find out more about our work at our website, Tertium Quids. .org. One of our favorite folks with the Competitive Enterprise Institute, author of 10,000 Commandments. You know him as Wayne Cruz. And Wayne, Happy New Year, sir. How are you doing this first weekend of 2019?
Doing great, and I appreciate you thinking of us and having us on the show. Happy New Year to you and you all, too.
Well, talk about this, because in years past, it wouldn't be a week into a new year and we'd have new regulations from pretty much any government. Yet you're in the press over the past week having reported on the fact that the Trump administration has the fewest new rules in recorded history, yet the media still wants to treat this guy like he's some sort of third world dictator.
Yeah, well, as you know, interestingly enough, the federal agencies put out over 3,000 rules and regulations every year. Unfortunately, Joe, that part hasn't changed. But what has changed is you heard there was a lot of talk about President Trump issuing an executive order saying that for every new regulation agencies put out, they have to get rid of two.
Yep.
And in each of the past 2 calendar years, in the fiscal year wrap-ups that the Office of Management and Budget would do, the Trump administration met that goal. So for significant regulations, not the rudimentary stuff, although, I think a lot of the rudimentary stuff actually has bigger impact than people think. But in terms of what's officially deemed significant, the Trump administration, in a technical sense, has met the requirement to eliminate 2 rules for every one. But now these are not going to be big sweeping things like, say, the Waters of the U.S. rule that our general counsel calls the Moistures of the United States rule, or the Clean Power Plan. It's not going to be the gigantic rules. It's going to be things that, and what they have been able to turn back are lesser items that were discretionary coming out of the agencies and so forth. Mm-hmm. And so for Trump's first calendar year, not the year that just ended, but the first calendar year, it was 3,200 rules that were issued, which was actually the lowest number since the Federal Register started publishing the statistics on numbers of rules. Incredibly, they didn't start even publishing that data until the mid-1970s. Although you think back, the New Deal since the 30s, Interstate Commerce Commission since 1887. So they haven't been publishing numbers of rules. But back in the 70s, rule counts every year were as high as 7,000, and then there were 5,000 and 4,000. It started going down into the 4s during the Reagan administration and the first Bush. And then Trump's first year was the lowest ever. His second year is the second lowest ever. Ties in a little bit to the issue of gets harder to pick the low-hanging 2-for-1 fruit.
Sure.
And not only that, if you want to get rid, the administrative states, the bureaucrats have made it pretty cushy for themselves. In order to get rid of, you can't get rid of a rule. In order to get rid of a regulation, you have to write a new one.
Right. So
even if you're trying to cut regulations, you have to write another one.
Well, and that's where it becomes clear that English majors are important in D.C. Wayne Cruz, and we're going to post up some of the coverage of your unconstitutionality index. Down to a 12, as high as almost 30 under Obama. But moreover, the president seems, hell-bent to put the hands of government back into Congress's hands. I can't recall a president that did more to promote congressional oversight over this stuff, and not in a way that a lot of people would say, "Oh, I want Congress to do this." He kept saying, "Do your job. Just I want to do something. I could easily do this myself, but you should be writing these rules and regulations." Talk about that part of the regulatory reform of putting the rulemaking power back in Congress and not in the unelected bureaucrats' hands.
Yes, indeed. You remember under President Obama, even in his State of the Union address, he said, "I have a pen and I have a phone.
Yep.
If Congress doesn't act, I'm going to act. Our administration's going to act. Our agencies are going to act." Well, you cannot. There, in addition to there being a pen and phone, there can also be Liberty's Meat Acts, and I hope that Trump continues to use that in terms of rolling back regulations. Now, obviously, Joe, there's some things where you got to keep an eye on Trump, too, because with trade policy, with antitrust policy, with his talk about free speech, with his saying, oh, yeah, we're going to go ahead and do ethanol anyway, there are areas where Trump potentially, and imagine his quote, deal with Nancy on infrastructure and things like that. So you got to still watch. You always have to stay vigilant no matter who's in power. But what you said is exactly right. Even one of the former Democratic under Obama administrators of the regulatory czar office, you might call it, he talked about Trump's the Justice Department's executive order, Justice Department's guidance on telling agencies they can't use guidance documents to govern. You might recall I said that agencies we're not even passing laws now, and It's not even that agencies are issuing 3,000 rules. They're just issuing guidances, notices, bulletins, circulars, memoranda, administrative interpretations. And I took to calling all this stuff regulatory dark matter, and I looked at it as kind of a spinoff of the pen and phone. The Trump administration has put a stop to those kinds of things, too. We recommend that in the 116th Congress, since none of the regulatory reform bills are going to get through the Nancy Pelosi Congress, instead the Trump administration needs to double down on what you're talking about, on the things it's already doing, in saying, no, Congress has to make the law. The executive branch can't make the law. That's Congress's job to do. That restoration of Article I power matters a lot, and I think Trump can do and we put out a kind of a fat paper on this back in October, saying that he needs to issue a new executive order in addition, and to sort of double down or compound on the 2-for-1, needs to issue a new executive order focused on regulatory dark matter and get these agencies to stop issuing all of these guidances and notices and so forth that they use to get around the need to write a regulation, let alone pass a law. And by the way, you mentioned the unconstitutionality index. That's kind of my joke way of pointing out what you're talking about. The agencies are the ones making most law now. Last year, Congress issued about 290 laws, but the agencies, they put out over 3,000 rules and regulations. So they're doing the bulk of the lawmaking in the country. It's not supposed to be that way. And so I took to joking and calling it the unconstitutionality index, and it gets a little bit of traction. It just focuses on the extent to which to who's really in the driver's seat.
I know that
unfortunately the government's steering and the free market system is just rowing.
Well, and it benefits, and it often, as we see it, one group or another will manipulate who is in office and who can push these regulations to their benefit. Short term, often. I remember somebody once saying that we needed to do something about big box stores, and I thought, gee, it's interesting here as we're watching Sears closing. Weren't they the original big box store that somebody had to do something about, and eventually the marketplace will consume all of that. Wayne, you talk about this, and I remember once you described it as if, one binder of laws created an entire wall bookcase full of regulations. And to me, that visual is stunning, but that's what we're seeing and what we're doing. And in real world impact, you talk about these letters of intent, technically, and guidance documents. That's what crippled places like our universities when it comes to Title IX. I mean, nobody changed. Yeah. Betsy DeVos didn't change Title IX. They just crumpled up the Obama administration's guidance letter and said, no.
That's right.
Enforce the law as it's written. Don't take this guidance letter to heart. Just do what the law says.
That's right. And it's interesting how that came to be a method of operation across the agencies. What you mentioned about there was Title IX, there was the bathroom guidance and so forth. The Department of Education and the Department of Justice issued jointly. In the Labor Department, there was guidance on franchise workers. So basically, like a McDonald's franchise is owned by a local guy. And the main McDonald's headquarters is not responsible for the local employees, but the Obama Labor Department was trying to change that and extend responsibility and basically just kill the entire franchise model, which Jim Blasingame of the Small Business Advocate website and radio show rightly calls that's like America's gift to the world, the whole franchise model, business model that's out there. And it really is. It's a way for anyone a lot of people, so many people have realized the American dream that way, and it interferes with that. But there was also Labor Department guidance on independent contracting and so forth. And Joe, the agencies were just issuing this stuff in a press release or even a blog post.
Oh,
and
gosh.
This happened with the President Obama's changes to the Obamacare statute after the fact, with regard to the individual mandate.
I had forgotten that. You're right.
Small business requirement, and it became absurd. And you can't. I called it one nation ungovernable in a paper. You can't operate that way, and something has to be done to rein it in. The Trump effort has been one that has put the focus on it, and I have liked in some of the more reasoned debates over it between conservatives, liberals, you might say, did recognize that the effect, despite all the criticism from the left of the Trump executive orders and regulation, it really is restoring that Article I power to Congress. Trump's executive orders on regulation limit his own power, and that's what I think people don't appreciate enough. But you see it. Some folks are starting to see it. It's coming out in the policy debate and so forth. So it's useful. And what I hope now, Joe, is that if he does another executive order on guidance documents or does some kinds of streamlining and compulsory reporting of all this stuff, be harder for the next president, even if it's a liberal, one of the more progressive wing liberal Democrats, it'd be harder to roll the stuff back. Right. Because even President Reagan's initial executive order called 12291 requiring cost benefit analysis, which I don't think makes the world that much of a greater place, but it at least puts a focus on regulation. That order has persisted. So if Trump can, as part of a legacy, leave some of those things in place to govern the regulatory state, if we're not getting that congressional accountability back, we can at least do the kinds of reporting and disclosure that make it possible for our successors or our descendants to do it in the future.
Wayne Cruz is on with us from the Competitive Enterprise Institute, author of most recently their Unconstitutionality Index, annually the 10,000 Commandments. And just imagine Moses trying to wheel that one down. Mount Sinai. So, right.
Unfortunately, it's a lot more than 10,000 now, but it just kind of rolls off the tongue better.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Wait, I want to go to what you were just saying about the Trump administration executive orders and responsibility for the rules and regulations, because I think people don't realize when it's just a letter and the Department of Education says this is what we want the law to mean, so this is how we want you to interpret, and then the rules aren't even written by the legislators. What you create is this intransparency that would make Jonathan Gruber engorge certain parts of his body. And so somebody trying to start a business or somebody trying to start a family even, or just get on in the world, they don't know who to talk to anymore because something could be harming their business, but who do you petition with? Where is your right of petition in this maelstrom?
Yeah, you can't. There was a great report that the House Committee on Oversight and Government Affairs put out last year. It was around May, and they called it Shining Light on Regulatory Dark Matter, which is the term we cooked up at CEI to talk about this stuff. But they asked the agencies, well, since 2008, give us a list of all of the guidance documents that you've put out and whether they're so-called economically significant. That's one of the government speak words for it costing $100 million a year. Or having a $100 million effect. It could go the other way. But give us a list of this stuff, and it's like pulling teeth. They have trouble finding the stuff. They do. Some of them ended up providing lists, but they're incomplete. It just isn't cataloged anywhere. And so we saw some legislation introduced. And by the way, if there were going to be anything bipartisan on regulatory reform, it'd probably be limited to just disclosure. So we will still see, we're a nonpartisan group. We're small L libertarian. That doesn't make us Republican or Democrat, and we try to reach out to both to say, here's something that can work. But when I testified on this regulatory dark matter, this guidance document, even the Democratic members of the Senate were saying this is like a black box because they ask the departments, education that you brought up, and Department of Labor. Well, when you decide you're going to engage in some kind of a regulatory undertaking, how do you decide whether you're going to issue a normal notice and comment rule that goes through public comment, or if you're going to issue a guidance or memorandum? And the answer, we don't know. And even the Democratic members didn't like
Sure.
that kind of an answer. So I think that given that the Democrats do hear from entrepreneurs, small business folks, and big business folks back in their district, there is some potential to do that kind of reform. But you said people can't find this stuff; they can't petition. It's exactly right. When I did the initial report on regulatory dark matter, the title was "Mapping Washington's Lawlessness," and the subtitle was a preliminary inventory of regulatory dark matter. And preliminary is exactly right, because I couldn't find the stuff, Joe. I would go to each agency's webpage and I would look, I would try different kind of search techniques. I would try different ways of finding the guidance documents. You'd have to figure out what they're calling it, because it's a whole word salad of different names they use for all these things. And so I put that initial compilation together and went from there. And then, of course, now Congress has looked at it. There's legislation introduced now called the Good Act, GOOD. It sounds like a religious revival, but it just stands for Guidance Out of Darkness. And but the idea is to say, well, it doesn't stop the agencies from doing it, but it just says you have to publish it. If you're issuing a guidance document, you got to put it in a central location. Everybody's got to be able to find it. We don't have that, Joe. So people can't petition it. The guidance can get out there, but even like a member who learns about it, if you find out about it, it's going to be happenstance. One thing in our favor of just quickly, one thing in our favor of getting some attention to this is the Bipartisan Administrative Conference of the United States put out a report just over a year ago. It was December of we're in December 2017, about guidance documents, and it was reaffirming that these things are not supposed to be binding on the public. And technically that's the case. They're not binding, but if you are in need of a permit or you need a waiver of some sort, you're not likely to cross an agency that has put out a piece of guidance stating what its interpretations are. So it's recognized on a bipartisan basis that this is an issue. And one reason I'm a little bit I can be a little bit optimistic is, you and I have talked in the past about tech policy and frontier technology and so forth, like driverless cars and artificial intelligence and all that. A lot of these new sectors, Joe, unfortunately are governed by guidance documents. Congress isn't passing a law. The agencies may or may not issue a rule, but the agencies are instead doing these guidance documents and putting these feelers out and putting out these kinds of interpretations. I think that's where we have some bipartisan interest, because when I have friendly debates with folks on the Hill and whatnot, even folks on the left, they don't necessarily want Uber or Airbnb and so forth regulated, and they have problems with guidance issues too. And since that's the main way the government is running the regulatory state now, I think we've got a little bit of traction even in this even in the new climate of a Democratic Congress.
Well, I love to hear that, because I always try to put it into something. Your friend and coworker there at CEI, Chris Horner, just published a piece about government for rent that we had him on about, where all these agencies, Bloomberg, Steyer, et cetera, are funding assistant lawyers working with AG's offices, and Chris made a great point. He said, what if the NRA did this with Republican AGs? Of course, people would be freaked out. And in your point, what if a Republican Department of Energy just wrote a letter saying, just put the pipeline in, for example, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. So those who would seek to say, no, hold on, we need to have a discussion about it, if there's a gift of the Trump administration, it's the idea that Democrats seem to think that a Democrat just writing rules with a pen in his phone was a good idea, but that ends when it becomes a Republican. You can't have it both ways. You have to bind in both directions.
Exactly, and I think that's where we start to get some traction. There are areas where we have to watch out for, like this new deal with Nancy on infrastructure and so forth.
Oh, sure.
The propensity of both parties is to see infrastructure as big spending, look for what's shovel ready and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then once the project the shine is worn off, the train stopped running right, or the sewer system can't handle diaper wipes and things like that, you really need to treat infrastructure more as private sector wealth, large-scale wealth,
mm-hmm.
large-scale capitalism.
Value.
And I hope we can do that. Because if we don't, see, the infrastructure campaign of this coming year is one where there's a potential leverage for the regulators to get back in and control things like the airspace for drones, or the driverless car policy, or smart city policy and things like that. So we've got to really, really keep our eyes out. But I think given that guidance has become such a major way that the regulatory state operates, we've got a little bit of bipartisan concern about it, and we'll try to take, to make sure that we express that as much as we can.
Wayne Cruz, Competitive Enterprise Institute, on with us on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Something you were just saying there, Wayne, really struck a chord. Virginia General Assembly getting together this coming Wednesday for their first, I guess technically they're all in Richmond, having cocktails at this point, getting ready for their session. 400 years of this, we've been doing it, and one of the big issues this year is broadband. The governor wants to spend his extra $1.2 billion on broadband to rural areas so that, some farm in Wise County can get, download Netflix fast, I guess. I don't know. But when we think of infrastructure, I go back to the granddaddy of all crony capitalists, Thomas Edison, who wanted to convince the world that you couldn't transmit electricity through the air to receivers in people's homes or cars. And so, he made some films and made it look like, this transmission would electrocute elephants. So far, we've been transmitting electricity through the air since the 30s, and with a few rhinos, apologies to the few rhinos we've singed, we haven't electrocuted any elephants yet. Talk about this zeal for constructing infrastructure, because I know what they're meaning when they say broadband. They want to run fiber out to every farm in Wise County and to the four corners of Virginia under the premise of its government infrastructure, and that the internet is going to be like the new telephone system out there. The internet has been chugging along fine, by the way. What is it now, a year and a couple of months since the end of net neutrality, and it's still there. All the dire things. So talk about that regulatory capture and what's going on in Virginia with that.
You put your finger on something that's a little bit worrisome, and you see policy folks and policymakers and legislators and FCC all singing this 5G song. And I have to say this non-chauvinistically, because my family has a farm in Southside Virginia where we have no service at all. Well, if you get in there with a Verizon phone, you pick something up, but my AT&T, I'm still not getting anything. I don't even have 3G. I don't even have 2G. I have 3G. That is, I can sometimes get a text message that pops in when the wind blows a certain way. But there's reasons for that. I was writing a piece kind of joking about it. I said, working together, we can keep country people off the internet like us. And I was thinking that,
you really don't want them there.
The natural evolution of things. Remember, it was the country folks. We set up barbed wire. We used barbed wire to do phone calls initially. You had to have governments come in and outlaw competition in order to give electricity companies their monopolies and give the telecommunications companies their monopolies 100 years ago, when we had a third world level GDP. So there's plenty potential for expanding infrastructure across the U.S. and in the rural areas. There's already, if I want to do it, clearly I can get a HughesNet satellite or get a Dish Network, or I can use my rural co-op through the phone and do internet that way. There are already options there. I worry, like it sounds a little bit like you're worried about. I worry about this kind of federalizing of everything, and looking at 5G as, we pronounce it, with a reverent tremble and say 5G. Well, what about all of the other infrastructures that we need out at our farm too? I was talking to folks. I said, look, you don't create an artificial rollout of a network where it's not necessarily needed. And I said, and didn't we just argue a couple of years ago against municipal broadband? And now we're talking about, with this and with smart cities, municipalizing everything. I said, what has happened to people's notions of free markets and market principles. You don't abandon that just because something gets a little more complex. You realize that that complexity means you need free markets more than ever. But I look at it this way, like you're there in Richmond. Richmond's there because you had to come up in the boats, and then the ships ran into rocks, so they had to put the cities there.
Right.
Same with New York, Washington, D.C. Well, don't start trying to do your 5G or do your rollouts in cities like they're talking about now with, going in and using eminent domain in all these ways. Let us in the country areas come make a deal with us as a private party out at our farm or anybody else's farm or my neighbors. We could be doing all kinds of 5G experiments out in the rural areas that aren't necessarily driven federally. And remember, we need lots of new infrastructure too. One of the ongoing debates is drones and drone recharging and delivery and so forth. Well, why not talk to folks like us out in the country? Well, not only are we going to put in the pods for 5G, the panels for 5G, but also we could put recharging stations for drones. I mean, there are just all kinds of options.
Well,
back in the old days of streetcars, what they would do with the public, rather than eminent domain and to get over the NIMBY, not in my backyard problem, is they'd offer people free lifetime service or free lifetime service for their descendants. So there are all kinds of ways of saying, let's get rid of regulations and get rid of franchises and then see what the markets evolve. And I think that is kind of getting left out of the debate. Instead, it's talking about subsidies and things of that sort, especially in the context of the upcoming infrastructure debate, which I think we just have to keep an eye on. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
I want to make sure that this rollout of new infrastructure is thought of in context of it being a free market evolution and one of many kinds of networks we need that can all work together to build out infrastructure. Instead, each infrastructure, you were talking about pipelines earlier, pipelines, water, sewer, electricity, cable, all of these are treated in separate silos. What if you broke those regulatory silos down and they could all work together to roll the infrastructure out? That sort of thing. That is what we need, and I think it gets left out of the debate.
I think you find this just as ironic as I do, Wayne, that the same folks who want to build wind farms everywhere don't want to put cell towers up, and I still wonder what the point is, because they're talking about infrastructure being wires and telephone poles, and I'd rather see a radio tower than a string of telephone poles with lines cutting across hillsides and dale.
Right.
And why in this day and age where we know Edison was wrong about transmissions, can't we just put some cell towers up? You'd think a guy like Mark Warner would get that, but maybe he doesn't anymore. Maybe he forgot after all these years away from the cell phone industry, because I think that's where really our answer is, and they don't want to do that. There's some idea that there's I guess there's money to be made at the end of it, and franchises and friend of a friend of a friend has a construction company that's going to put in all the telephone poles, and that's what we mean when we say shovel ready. And that's what I'm glad you're helping us fight against, Wayne. Are those regulations and those letters of intent that the government writes that really just make money for people?
Yeah, well, we're going to keep at it. I think a big job of our movement is to look for, you're always looking at the frontier. What's the new sector? What's not regulated yet? And try to keep the regulatory tentacles from growing into the new area. So when you think about 5G, you want to remove all of the barriers to it rather than do things that artificially put it in places where it might not otherwise go. And I'm saying this is, I'm in a place where there's no service. I have options to do things to get service, but I would much rather be approached with someone who's trying to expand networks and offers better deals. They work with neighbors, and it's easier. The rocks in the river, they're not out there in the country. It should be easier, not harder, to do these projects in areas that are less populated.
Well, let me ask you this.
I think we have to learn from that way. Things grow organically rather than top down.
You and I were both at the Consumer Electronics Show last year, and Qualcomm, Verizon, and I'm trying to remember the third group that was there doing their 5G keynote. And one of the things that struck me was that the fellow from Verizon said this 5G stuff is not consumer driven. And I thought that was interesting because it's about driverless cars. It's about smart cities. And the guy from, it was the guy from China who was just doe-eyed about President Xi and all the cities that he just snaps his fingers and builds across China in these new smart cities. And I guess they'll just close the old ones down and move into the smart ones. But it's about driverless cars. It's about distance medicine. It's about it's about no lag time, and it's not about my cell service anymore. It's not about my internet speed. Is that one of the problems with 5G? Is that it's not really about consumer products, or are they just trying to keep us away from it?
In a way, it can be a problem. Sometimes it's good. Consumers may not know what they want in the sense that you didn't know you needed an iPhone 15 years ago. And it's great when someone comes up with the idea and thinks you might and rolls it out. But the difference is they take their own risk.
Right.
With politicized 5G, that's not necessarily the case. 5G doesn't even exist, really. It's a slate of technologies. It's 5 or 6 different kinds of technologies that are being worked on by different companies and gradually rolled out. But what they're after, and we were talking about, even Trump could, with like antitrust and all these other ways, he could become a regulator either intentionally or inadvertently if we don't keep an eye on him too. But remember, he even talked about the nationalized 5G network. You remember that about a year ago?
Oh, yeah.
So he said something about a nationalized 5G network, and then Ted Cruz had popped up and put out a statement saying, there should never be a nationalized 5G network and all that. Any network that's set up politically like that is going to be much, much inferior to what's really needed, because one of the big problems in 5G and in the rollout of smart cities and these new kinds of data-driven technologies is their potential for invalid surveillance.
Yeah.
Their potential to not just collect your information as part of the way they operate, but to mandate that you share your information.
Exactly.
And I'd even seen exactly. And see, that's what's concerning me about some of the smart city hysteria. It's a lot because I think they're going to be stupid rather than smart, and it makes a lot more sense to try this stuff out in smaller areas. Well, if you don't come out to our farm, give it a shot in Gretna or Brook Neal.
But it's the old
you don't
get
have to
a
come
warrant.
all the way to the rural area, but test this stuff out. Make
Right.
sure it works. Make sure that the drones and the cars aren't bumping into each other. Don't try to do it in a city and dump it in with a new infrastructure bill. But test these things out organically and see what consumers want.
Right.
Because there was that notion that we just got to put all this stuff in place and away we go. But I think that ends up being way too much of a surveillance state and way too heavily oriented toward public-private partnerships, which makes me cringe. When
absolutely.
You have too much government involvement in what's going on, and so you end up with a so-called smart city that's not really a private enterprise function at all. It's entirely politicized. Mm-hmm. And if the technologies are as capable as what they say, and even as what we can see, that means if you thought regulatory guidance was a bad thing, imagine if EPA is tweaking your tailpipe in your smart car from sitting here in Washington. Oh, Joe, you got too much emissions coming out of your car.
Right.
So we're going to tweak you from here. So they don't even, let alone laws, let alone writing rules and regulations, and let alone even guidance. They just control.
They just could send you a bill for the fine saying, "Oh, sorry, we happen to notice that you were driving your car longer than we deemed fit, or you have to get a permit for it," because then the permit state gets grown as well. And
look how easy they made that carbon tax.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It was like they had it waiting, Wayne. It's amazing. But anyway, Wayne, we have to let you go. Competitive Enterprise Institute, CEI.org. Read all of his stuff there. I know there's a special website for the 10,000 Commandments. Is it 10k.org?
CEI.org/10KC.
10KC.
And Joe, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate that. Taking the time and thinking of it.
Well, we have other guests to get on this program. Otherwise, we just go for the full hour. Wayne, it's great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it, and we'll talk to you again plenty of times in the new year. Enjoy the Consumer Electronics Show.
Awesome. Take care. Happy New Year. Goodbye.
We'll be right back with more Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Welcome back to this New Year's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy and Tertium Quids. And our legislative advisor, Caleb Taylor, is on the Newsmakers line with us to kind of get a scene set, because this Wednesday, the 400th anniversary edition of the Virginia General Assembly. I don't know what the color, I think gold is 50 years. I'm not sure what 400 years anniversary is. But good to hear from you, Caleb. Happy New Year. How are you doing this morning, sir?
I'm doing wonderful. It's wonderful to speak with you. And I believe the 400-year anniversary is Medicaid expansion.
Oh, okay. Well, at least then we've already given them their gift. It's, and higher taxes for the rest of us. Less silver.
Absolutely.
So what kind of things are we watching at Tertium Quids and the Virginia Institute for Public Policy in terms of legislation that has been, it seems like a quiet session. Am I wrong? Am I missing something? Or?
It is so far. Now, although the session starts on Wednesday, this upcoming, the actual end date for all the bills coming in isn't until the 18th.
Oh,
so we should see quite a few more. They, sometimes they like to keep right until the very end to, I guess, give the rest of us less time to read the bill. But we should see more. But we do expect, this is a short session, so we do expect it to be a little bit quieter than I guess it was last year. The 2018 session was just a rambunctious session.
Mm-hmm. Well, you saw how it came out, especially right after the election. But I guess with an election looming, is it more? And I always wonder, Virginia's General Assembly teeters. They do a lot of campaigning from the floor, but not through legislation. It's a lot of standing in opposition to somebody else's legislation is where I see some of the most fireworks when there's an election looming.
That's generally the case. They tend to, especially Republicans, tend to moderate once an election is coming about. And since as Virginia, we have so many elections.
Yeah.
I mean, we have an election every year, essentially. That means there's a lot of moderation going on. But yeah, they tend to move back towards the middle come election time, and then that doesn't give us a lot of really exciting, moves on the legislative agenda. There are some things that we're kind of keeping an eye on currently, and then there's some more things that we're expecting to come out in terms of healthcare freedom and some other stuff that we're kind of keeping an eye on and seeing if we're going to see anything really exciting come down the pipe.
Well, I guess
can't imagine it's going to be amazing, but there's going to be stuff out there that we're going to need to keep a look at.
Well, with the governor announcing that he's got big plans for this $1.2 billion spending spree he's going to go on based on, and I presume it's just Common Core math. Everyone I've talked to said they don't know where he's getting the money, but Delegate Landis, who's a banker, said to me that there is more spending in this second year proposed of the biennium than was in the original biennium in both years. So he's trying to make drunken sailors look spendthrift, isn't he?
Well, yes. He, I imagine that he has quite a few things that he would like to spend some money on. That always kinds of presents goodwill from certain voters, putting the money out there. I agree. I don't see where he's going to get it from. And with Medicaid expansion having come through last year, we're already seeing some significant overages. Reports coming out now, internal reports coming out now that are just the overages are just going to be insane. And
funny is if there had been people saying that this was what was going to happen, and hold it, yeah, that's right, we must have done a half a dozen programs saying this was exactly what was going to happen.
This was an inevitability. The overages, the woodwork, or people coming out of the woodwork, stuff like that. Those were all inevitable. Nobody felt like listening because, it's kind of one of those things where, well, we're trying to get the voters, as opposed to we're trying to do the right thing. That's just kind of the nature of the beast in this regard. So we're trying to deal with that as best we can, especially in terms of healthcare.
Right.
Several of the things that we're looking for, we've got a what we call kind of a basket of healthcare initiatives that will kind of increase little by little increase supply in medical services, so that we can start meeting the new demand that Medicaid causes. Because that's kind of the real, if we really boil it down, that's one of the major problems that Medicaid expansion has always had, is it really does increase, you give people free money, they tend to want to spend it. It increases demand, but it doesn't do anything for supply. Well, when that happens, prices all across the board go up.
Yeah.
And so, there's a number of initiatives out there to try to increase, some of which were vetoed last session by the governor.
Are you talking about sort of like the certificate of need legislations, things like that would open up, marketplaces without having to wait for your competitors to decide there's room for you, that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's right. So COPN legislation is still on the docket. We've seen at least one bill come out. It is not a bill that we're excited about. Currently, it's House Bill 1680. Mm-hmm. It's a rather large bill. It's based off a bill from last session. The issue with it is that it doesn't repeal COPN. Oh. It does open up. It does improve the process a bit, which is nice. We can be appreciative of that, but the problem is that it actually adds more of more issues. It involves right now it's, if you want a COPN, if you want a certificate of need, if you run a doctor's office, and you want to put an MRI machine in, you go to this commission, and the commission makes the decision, and you kind of have to deal with them. And the commission's kind of loosely involved with the hospital associations through election donations and whatnot, kind of in a long, big trail of different stuff. But now this new bill creates an advisory committee.
Oh, well, that's always good.
Yeah, that's always good, because one, the people on the advisory committee are going to get paid, and we already don't have any money. And the second thing is the advisory committee is made up of the hospital associations.
Oh, that's even better.
Amazing, yes, and it's codified. So it's essentially taking every doctor's major competitor in the state and making that competitor the one who decides whether or not they can expand.
So what about from the Democratic Party side? What kind of agenda points are we seeing from them, or has it been just as quiet from the Democratic Party side of what does David Toscano call it, the run for 51 now? Are they going to keep quiet on real agenda points and just hope to win majority this year in the House and Senate?
Well, see, that from my point of view, that's kind of a toss-up. I mean, I can see the older crowd in the Democratic Party being convinced that that's the best way to go. The freshmen in, I could see them wanting to go in the opposite direction. I mean, we've already heard some talk of legislation. I haven't seen it come across the wire yet, but we've heard some talk of legislation to flip the right to work in the state,
right.
Which would be, from an economic standpoint, would just be a really, really horrible thing for the state. But great for the Democratic Party coffers.
Great for North Carolina, and Indiana, and places where they've just picked up the right to work legislation, and we're going the other way from it. It's interesting and certainly probably well funded as well, since it would be the first time somebody's gone the other direction in uncounted years.
Oh yeah, and I can't imagine that would go very far, but there are a lot of whispers coming out of specifically the offices of the freshman delegates and senators that we're having that kind of conversation.
Okay.
So it tends to be the younger crowd that, they want to be hard charging and this is the way we win. And then the older crowd tends to be the other way. So, it's a toss up to see which side in the Democratic Party is going to win.
Well, no wonder David Toscano says, I don't want to be House Minority Leader anymore. It sounds like he's got the toughest job
want to be either.
Richmond. Yeah. Well, Caleb, I appreciate that. We'll continue to watch, and it sounds like we'll need to kind of get you back here before the 18th to go over some of the stuff once we start seeing what it is. And, of course, a lot of it just mysteriously vanishes in the pocket vetoes in the House because we've been told a lot about cameras in the conference rooms, but there's still no recorded votes or anything, so we still don't know in a lot of cases who votes for or against bills that just vanish in the night as the session goes on. So we need to get into that a little bit more as well as the 18th approaches, certainly for that deadline. But thank you for everything you do. He's the legislative advisor to Tertium Quids. And have a New Year's been good for you? Christmas was good?
Oh, it was wonderful. Got everything I could possibly want.
Well, that's it. Then what are we all doing here? No, it's 400 years of the General Assembly. One of these years we'll get it right. Caleb, thank you, sir. You have a wonderful weekend, and thanks for joining us this week.
You as well. Thank you.
Thank you for listening as well, and you can continue to track legislation we're watching by going to our website, tertiumquids.org. Until next week, so long, and thanks for all the fish.